With only a few coins to her name and a brutal winter looming, the widow Eleanor believed all hope was lost. The roof of her barn, the last legacy of her late husband, had been ripped away by a tornado, and no one in the territory would fix it. For the pittance she could offer. Just then, a starving cowboy appeared like a ghost from the desert, gaunt and exhausted. He offered to take on the impossible task for nothing more than a few meals and a place to sleep. But Eleanor had no idea that the man she'd just taken in was no ordinary drifter. He was a mystery, a fugitive carrying a secret that could either be her salvation or her ruin. Dawn had just painted the arid valley in shades of gold, yet Eleanor could already feel the scorching heat of a new day on her face. She wiped the beads of sweat from her forehead with a worn sleeve, her gaze heavy as she looked out upon the desolate landscape that had become her life. Only a few months ago, this place was still a home, when her husband William was still alive. Now as she stared at the gaping hole in her barn's roof, she felt an invisible weight crushing her slender shoulders. The storm that had swept through 2 weeks prior had done more than just tear away wooden planks. It had carried away her last shred of hope. That barn was all of William's pride and passion. He had built it with his own hands, choosing each timber, driving each nail with love and determination. Now it was just a barren skeleton, a sad, giant scar against the morning sky. Eleanor walked down the porch steps, her worn-out boots crunching on the dry earth. She needed to fix that roof before the rainy season arrived, but she had no idea where to begin. Her finances were in dire straits. The costs of the funeral and medicine had drained their meager savings. In her pocket, she had exactly $11 and a few loose cents. Winter was approaching, and without a proper barn, she would lose the last of her livestock. Suddenly, the clatter of hooves from a distance pulled her from her thoughts. A lone figure on horseback was slowly approaching the ranch. As he drew closer, Eleanor could see that both man and horse had been through terrible times. The animal was so thin its ribs showed, its steps weary as if it existed on willpower alone. The man astride it was no better, his clothes faded and covered in patches, his hat so worn its original color was impossible to guess. When he reached the gate, the man stopped, lightly tipping the brim of his hat in a polite gesture. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, his voice hoarse from thirst in the road. "My name is James. I was wondering if you had any work that needed doing around here." Eleanor studied him carefully. He looked to be in his 30s, with dark, overgrown hair and a thick beard that seemed more a product of circumstance than choice. But his eyes were a deep brown, and despite his obvious hardship, they held a warmth and kindness that surprised her. Most drifters who passed through these parts had a much harder edge. "What kind of work can you do?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral. She had learned to be cautious with strangers, especially since William had passed. James glanced around the property, his eyes taking in the broken barn, the sagging fence, the general state of disrepair. "I can fix just about anything that needs fixing," he said simply. "Carpentry, mending fences, roofing. I don't ask for much, ma'am, just a meal and perhaps a place for my horse to rest for the night." A small flicker of hope ignited in Eleanor's chest, but she tried not to show it. "That barn roof," she said, pointing toward the damaged structure. "Do you think you could handle something that large?" James turned to look at the barn, and Eleanor watched his face intently. 2 other men had already come to look, and both had shaken their heads and ridden away. But James didn't shake his head. Instead, he studied it thoroughly, his eyes moving from the damaged section to the intact portions, as if he were already planning the repairs in his mind. "Yes, ma'am. I believe I can," he finally answered. "It will take some time and materials, but the framework underneath still looks solid. Your husband built this well." The mention of William brought a lump to Eleanor's throat, but she swallowed the emotion. How long would it take? About a week, maybe a little more if the weather holds, James replied. Eleanor did a quick mental calculation. She could manage the food, but the lumber and nails would cost money she didn't have. I'll be honest with you, she said, surprised by her own openness. I don't have much to pay. My husband passed recently, and things are very tight. I can manage 3 meals a day, a place to sleep, and perhaps $3 when the job is done. She expected him to decline and leave. Like the others. $3 for such a monumental task was almost an insult. But James simply nodded slowly. That's more than fair, ma'am. When would you like me to start? Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. For the first time in weeks, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. Well then, I suppose you can put your horse in what's left of the barn. There's still some hay in the loft, and the water trough still works. James dismounted, his movements careful and deliberate. Up close, Eleanor could see he was even thinner than she'd first thought. I appreciate this opportunity, ma'am, he said as he led his horse toward the barn. I promise you won't be disappointed. Eleanor watched him go, noticing a quiet confidence in his stride, a dignified air that didn't fit the image of a drifter. As she walked back to the kitchen to prepare breakfast, Eleanor couldn't help but wonder about this man's story. How did someone with his bearing end up in this situation? But those were questions for another time. Right now, she had a barn roof that needed fixing, and for the first time since the storm, someone was willing to do it for a price she could actually afford. Perhaps her luck was finally starting to change. Before the sky had fully brightened, James was already awake. Eleanor watched from her kitchen window as he emerged from the barn, stretching and looking up at the sky. She had given him a few old blankets and a dry corner to sleep in, but she hadn't expected him to start his day so early. She quickly put the coffee pot on the stove and began mixing batter for pancakes. When she stepped outside to call him for breakfast, she found him standing there, observing the roof with an unusual intensity. He wasn't just glancing at the damage. He was studying every beam, every joint, running a hand along the wood as if testing its strength. Breakfast is ready, she called out. James turned, and for a moment, Eleanor saw something in his eyes that made her pause. It wasn't the casual interest of a hired hand. It was the focused attention of someone who completely understood what he was looking at. Thank you, ma'am, I'll be right in, he said, but he didn't move immediately. He continued to examine the structure for another moment before heading toward the house. At the table, Eleanor poured him coffee and watched him quietly. She had made extra pancakes, assuming a man who had traveled so much would be hungry, but she was once again surprised by his table manners. His movements were refined and deliberate. He thanked her for each serving, and he even used his napkin properly. Most hired hands she knew ate as if the world was about to end. You've done this kind of work before, she said, more a statement than a question. James nodded, waiting until he'd finished his bite to answer. Yes, ma'am. My father taught me carpentry when I was young. He said a man should know how to build things with his own hands. Was your father a carpenter? A distant look crossed James's face for a moment. Among other things, he said softly, then quickly changed the subject. I'll need to go into town today to get more materials. Do you have a wagon I could borrow? Eleanor's heart sank. She had hoped he had his own supplies, though she knew it was unrealistic. I have a wagon, but James... I have to be honest. I don't have much money for materials right now. James set his coffee cup down and looked at her directly. How much? Can you manage? About $15, maybe $20 if I stretch it, she whispered, feeling embarrassed to admit her situation. To her surprise, James just nodded as if it were a perfectly reasonable sum. That should be enough for what we need. I know how to make materials last, and I have a few ideas for reusing what's already here. After breakfast, James hitched Eleanor's old mare to the wagon and prepared to leave. That evening, when he Returned, the wagon was filled with lumber, nails, and tar paper. Eleanor was amazed at the quantity of supplies he had managed to buy with the little money she had given him. "How did you manage all this?" she asked. James began to unload the materials carefully. "I know the owner of the lumber yard. I persuaded him to give me a fair price." "I thought you said you were just passing through this area?" James paused for a moment, and Eleanor caught a flicker of something in his expression. "I've passed through here a few times before," he said simply, and continued his work. The next morning, as James began the repairs, all of Eleanor's suspicions about his abilities were confirmed. This was not the rough, makeshift work she had expected. James worked with the precision of a master artisan. She watched from the house as he carefully removed the damaged sections of the roof, saving every piece of usable wood. He didn't just tear things down. Instead, he took the time to sort the materials into neat piles. When he began to rebuild the framework, Eleanor was completely captivated. Every cut was measured twice, every joint fit perfectly. He even reinforced areas that hadn't been damaged, making the entire structure stronger than it was originally. "You're making it better than it was before," she commented when she brought him water at midday. James wiped the sweat from his brow and nodded. "There's no point in doing a job if you're not going to do it right. This roof will probably last you 20 years now, maybe 30 if you keep the gutters clean." Eleanor looked more closely at his work. The joints were so precise they looked like the work of a furniture maker. "Where did you learn to work like this?" she asked again. That distant look returned to James's face. "My father was very particular about craftsmanship. He used to say that the way a man builds something reveals his true character." As the days passed, Eleanor found herself looking forward to their conversations during meals. James was well-spoken and clearly educated, though he was always careful not to reveal too much about his past. One evening, she saw him in the barn, reading one of William's books by candlelight. The book was one of William's favorites, a collection of essays on agriculture and land management, not exactly light reading for a tired cowboy at the end of the day. "I hope you don't mind," James said when he noticed her watching. "I saw the books on the shelf and wondered if I could borrow one." "Of course not." She paused, her curiosity getting the better of her. "That's not an easy book to get through," James smiled slightly. "I've always been interested in how things work. Farming, building, land management. It's all connected, you know." Eleanor did know, but she was surprised that a drift-in cowboy would understand such concepts. The more time she spent around James, the more questions she had about who he really was. By the end of the week, the barn roof was nearly complete, and it was clearly a masterpiece. James had not only repaired the damage, but had improved the entire structure. As Eleanor looked at the exquisite craftsmanship, she realized she had stumbled upon something extraordinary. This couldn't be just any hungry cowboy looking for work. This was a man with skills, education, and refinement that suggested a very different background. The only question left was, what was a man like this doing out here, wandering the territory with only the clothes on his back? The work was finished, and the barn roof was now breathtakingly beautiful. Eleanor stood in her yard, looking up at James's handiwork with a mixture of joy and sorrow. Joy, because her barn now looked better than it ever had, and sorrow, because she knew that James would soon be on his way. In just over a week, he had become an indispensable part of the ranch's daily rhythm, and she knew she would miss his presence terribly. That evening, after James had retired to the barn for the night, Eleanor sat alone at her kitchen table, finally forcing herself to face the pile of paperwork she had been deliberately avoiding. William's desk was still there, overflowing with bills, land deeds, and business letters that she needed to sort through. She had put it off because every time she touched his things, it felt like saying goodbye to him all over again. She pulled the lamp closer and began to sort the stack of papers into piles, bills on one side, important documents on another, and personal letters in a third. About halfway through, she discovered something that made her freeze. It was an old newspaper, yellowed with age, folded carefully, and tucked between some old receipts. The paper was from Denver, dated nearly 2 years ago. She carefully unfolded it. Her eyes were immediately drawn to a large, bold headline on the front page. Railroad Empire heir disappears after massive theft scandal. Beneath it was a detailed article about a young man named Thomas Rothschild, who had vanished after being accused of stealing $50,000 from his family's railroad company. Eleanor's hands began to shake as she read on. The missing man was described as the son of railroad baron Jonathan Rothschild, one of the wealthiest men in the West. According to the article, Thomas had been caught embezzling from the company's payroll fund and had disappeared the night before he was scheduled to appear in court. But it was the accompanying photograph that made Eleanor's blood run cold. Despite the formal attire and clean-shaven face, she recognized those deep brown eyes immediately. The man in the picture was James, who was sleeping in her barn at this very moment. Eleanor sat in stunned silence, her mind reeling. Man she'd hired to fix her roof, the man she had shared meals with for over a week, was wanted for stealing more money than she could earn in 10 lifetimes. He was also the heir to one of the largest railroad fortunes in the country. She read the article more carefully this time. The theft had occurred in Colorado. Thomas had been the payroll manager, and dozens of railroad workers had gone without pay because of it. The article also mentioned a $5,000 reward for any information leading to the capture of Thomas Rothschild. $5,000. The sum was enough to save her ranch, pay off all her debts, and allow her to live comfortably for years. She put the paper down, walked to the window, and looked out at the barn. Could a person like that truly be a criminal? She remembered the man who had spent the last week working so diligently on her roof. James had been kind, respectful, and had created a beautiful work of art for almost nothing in return. He had never asked for anything more than food and shelter. That night, Eleanor barely slept, staring at the ceiling, trying to decide what to do. Part of her wanted to saddle her horse and ride straight to town to tell the sheriff. But another part of her couldn't do it. The next morning, when James walked into the kitchen, she could hardly look him in the eye. She kept glancing at his face, comparing it to the photograph in the newspaper she had hidden in her apron pocket. "Good morning, Eleanor," James said, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. "The roof is all finished. I just need to clean up the work area and I'll be ready to be on my way." Eleanor's heart constricted at the words, "on my way." If she was going to confront him, it had to be now. "James," she said, her voice smaller than she intended, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." James sat down at the table and looked at her with the same kind eyes she had grown so accustomed to. Eleanor took a deep breath, pulled the newspaper from her pocket, and placed it on the table. Right between them, James's expression changed instantly. The color drained from his face, and his shoulders slumped like a man who had been carrying a heavy burden for too long. "Let me guess," he said softly, his voice strangely calm, making no attempt at denial. "You now know what this newspaper says?" "I do," Eleanor replied, surprised at the steadiness of her own voice. "But I don't know what really happened." James was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the old newspaper. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with a profound sadness that made Eleanor's chest ache. "I didn't take that money," he said simply. "But I have no way to prove it. And I can't go back to face the charges, because I don't think I'd live long enough to see a trial." Eleanor stared at James, her mind racing at his words. Fear of not surviving to see a trial. What did that mean? "What do you mean?" she asked. James ran a hand over his face, the weary gesture making him look a decade older. "The man who really Stole the money is my father's business partner, a man named Vincent Hartwell. He had been skimming from the company for years, but he was very sophisticated about it. When the large theft was discovered, he arranged it so all the evidence pointed to me. Why would he do that? Eleanor's heart was beating fast, because I found out what he was doing. I uncovered his scheme and confronted him. I told him I was going to tell my father everything. James's voice grew bitter. 2 days later, $50,000 went missing. Somehow, all the paperwork pointed to me as the culprit. But your father, surely he would believe you over a business partner. James let out a dry, empty laugh. My father and Vincent have been friends for 20 years. To me, Vincent was like a second father since I was a boy. When the evidence came out, even my own father believed I was guilty. Eleanor studied James's face as he spoke. She had lived on the ranch long enough to learn how to read people, and everything in his expression and tone told her he was speaking the truth. "So you ran," she said softly. "I ran like a coward. I should have stayed and fought, but I was too scared. Vincent has connections everywhere. He could have easily had me killed in jail and made it look like an accident." A chill ran down Eleanor's spine. She was harboring a fugitive, but if James was telling the truth, he was an innocent man framed by someone far more powerful. The question now was, what was she going to do about it? Eleanor looked at James across the kitchen table, her mind racing with possibilities. The reward money could save her ranch, but something in his story felt true. "Show me proof," she said. Finally, James looked up, confused. "Proof of what?" "Show me some proof. If Vincent really framed you, there must be a trace of it somewhere. You said you discovered his scheme, so what did you find?" James's eyes widened slightly, as if this were the first time anyone had asked him to prove his innocence instead of just running. I had documents, ledger pages, receipts, bank records. But I left it all behind when I fled in a panic." "What were those documents about?" Eleanor leaned forward. "Vincent was clever. He created fake employee names on the payroll, then pocketed their wages. He also inflated the costs of supplies and kept the difference. I found discrepancies going back nearly 3 years. And you just left all that evidence behind?" James looked ashamed. I panicked. When I confronted him, Vincent just laughed and told me no one would believe me. He said he had been preparing for this moment for months. Eleanor stood up and began to pace around the small kitchen. Her husband, William, had always said she was too stubborn, but right now, she was grateful for that stubbornness. An idea was forming in her mind, and the more she thought about it, the more sense it made. "James," she said, stopping to look directly at him, "what if we could prove that Vincent is the real thief? How would we do that? I told you, I left all the evidence." "But," Eleanor said, "Vincent doesn't know that you left it behind. He doesn't know that you know about his other schemes. What if we could trick him into revealing himself?" James shook his head. "You don't understand how dangerous this man is. He has money, power, and connections. If he even suspected you were involved in this, he would destroy you without a second thought." "Perhaps, but I'm already being destroyed." Eleanor sat back down, her hands flat on the table. "James, I have $11 to my name. The bank is going to foreclose on this ranch in 2 months. I'm about to lose everything William and I built together. So you tell me, what do I have to lose by taking this risk?" James stared at her face for a long moment. "You could lose your life. Vincent has had people killed for less. Then we'll have to be smarter than him." Over the next hour, Eleanor and James worked out the basics of a plan. James would write a letter to Vincent, claiming he was tired of running and ready to make a deal. He would offer to disappear permanently in exchange for a share of the money Vincent had stolen over the years. The letter would hint that James had hidden evidence that could expose Vincent's crimes. "His greed will get the better of him," James explained. He'll want to know what evidence I have and where I hid it. And then, Eleanor said with a grim smile, we'll wait for him to come to us. She explained the rest of her idea. While James wrote the letter, she would ride into town and have a conversation with Sheriff Anderson. She wouldn't reveal James's true identity, but she would mention that she'd heard rumors of railroad corruption and ask what a person should do if they had evidence of a crime. Sheriff Anderson is an honest man, Eleanor said. And he's smart enough to read between the lines. James was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the barn he had just finished repairing. This is insane, he finally said. We're talking about going up against one of the most powerful men. Yes, we are. But James, think of it this way. What's the worst that can happen? We fail, and Vincent has us killed. Well, unlikely to die. Anyway, when winter comes with no money for food. At least this way, we go down fighting. Something in Eleanor's voice must have convinced him. James slowly nodded. All right, but we do this carefully. One mistake and we're both dead. That evening, Eleanor found herself looking at James differently. The scared, desperate man who had knocked on her door was still there, but now she could see glimpses of the educated, wealthy young man he once was. James, can I ask you something personal? Of course. What was your life like before? I mean, you were rich, you had a future. What was that like? James was silent for a moment, staring into the fire Eleanor had built in the hearth. Lonely, he finally said. I had money, fine clothes, a big house, but I didn't have many real friends. Most people wanted to be around me because of my father's money, not because they actually liked me. Is that why you've been so kind to me? Because I didn't know who you were? James looked at her with surprise. Eleanor, you were kind to me. Because that's who you are. You took in a stranger, fed him, gave him work when you could barely afford it. You don't do that because of money or status. You do that because you have a good heart. As Eleanor prepared for bed that night, she realized that over the past week, James had become more than just a hired hand. He had become a friend. Perhaps even more. Tomorrow they would set their dangerous plan in motion. They would either succeed or they would both pay the ultimate price. But tonight, for the first time since William died, Eleanor felt more hopeful than ever. She had a purpose. Again, and she had someone fighting by her side. 3 weeks passed like a century. With each passing day, Eleanor felt her hope dwindle. Perhaps Vincent was too clever to fall into the trap, or perhaps he simply didn't care about James's threats. Whatever the reason, the silence and the waiting were slowly eroding her spirit. Then, on a chilly Tuesday morning, a stranger rode up to the ranch. Eleanor was feeding the chickens when she heard the approaching hooves. She looked up to see a well-dressed man on a magnificent black stallion, the kind of horse that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. The rider was in his 50s, with silver hair and expensive clothes that looked completely out of place in the rugged territory of New Mexico. Mrs. Martinez, I presume, the man called out as he dismounted. His voice was smooth and cultured, but something about it made Eleanor's skin crawl. Yes, that's me, Eleanor replied, trying to keep her voice from trembling. She had a terrible feeling she knew exactly who this was. My name is Vincent Hartwell. I believe you have something that belongs to me. Eleanor's heart began to race, but she forced herself to remain calm. I'm sorry, Mr. Hartwell, but I don't know what you're talking about. Vincent smiled, but it was the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. Oh, I think you do. You see, I received a very interesting letter a few weeks ago. A letter postmarked from this town and signed by someone I've been looking for. I still don't understand. Where is Thomas Rothschild, Mrs. Martinez? Eleanor tried to look confused. I don't know anyone by that name. Vincent's smile grew wider and more dangerous. Please don't insult my intelligence. The letter came from this address. Thomas is here, and I want to speak with him. Eleanor glanced quickly toward the barn, hoping James was ready. According to their plan, he should be. Hidden in the loft with a clear view of the yard. She just needed to stall for time until Sheriff Anderson arrived. Even if I did know someone by that name, Eleanor said carefully, why would that be any of your business? Because Thomas stole $50,000 from my railroad company and disappeared. I'm here to collect both the money and the thief. $50,000? That's a terrible amount of money. Are you sure this Thomas person actually took it? Vincent's eyes narrowed. What are you implying? Eleanor took a deep breath. This was the most dangerous part of their plan. Well, I'm just a simple ranch woman. But it seems to me that if someone really wanted to steal that much money, they'd be smart enough to disappear somewhere far away. Why would they stick around nearby to send letters? Perhaps because they're not as smart as they think, Vincent said. Or perhaps, Eleanor said, her voice growing stronger, it's because they didn't actually take the money in the first place. Vincent's expression changed completely. The false politeness vanished, replaced by something cold and threatening. You're walking on very dangerous ground, Mrs. Martinez. Am I? Or am I just asking reasonable questions? Before Vincent could respond, James stepped out from the barn. Eleanor's heart leaped into her throat. This was not part of their plan. James was supposed to stay hidden until the sheriff arrived. Hello, Vincent, James said quietly. It's been a long time. Vincent spun around, his hand instinctively moving toward his coat. Eleanor noticed he was carrying a gun. Thomas, you look terrible. I almost didn't recognize you. Running for your life tends to change a person, James replied. He walked slowly toward them, his hands visible and empty. You got my message that I wanted to meet. My message? I think you have that backward. You wrote to me, remember? About some kind of deal. James nodded. That's right. I'm tired of running, Vincent. I want this to end. Good. Then you can return the money you stole and come back to face justice. What money? James asked. You mean the money you stole and then blamed on me? Vincent laughed, but there was no humor in it. Still telling that same lie? Do you really think anyone will believe you? I think they might when they see the evidence. Vincent's hand moved closer to his gun. What evidence? The records I kept of your fake employees, the receipts from your shell companies, the bank statements showing where the money really went. You're bluffing. You left everything behind when you ran. James smiled for the first time since Vincent had arrived. Did I? Are you sure about that? Eleanor carefully watched Vincent's face. She could see him thinking, trying to figure out if James was telling the truth. The greed in his eyes was exactly what James had predicted. Even if you had evidence, Vincent said slowly, who would believe it? I'm a respected businessman. You're a wanted fugitive. Perhaps. But I'm no longer the only one who knows the truth. Vincent's eyes darted to Eleanor, then back to James. What is that supposed to mean? It means, a new voice rang out, that we've been listening to this entire conversation. Sheriff Anderson stepped out from behind the house, his gun drawn and pointed directly at Vincent. Behind him came two deputies, also armed. Vincent's face went white. This is a trap. Yes, it is, James said calmly. And you just confessed to everything. A wave of relief washed over Eleanor. Their plan had worked to perfection. The sheriff had arrived at exactly the right time and had heard Vincent's own words condemn him. You can't prove anything, Vincent said, but his voice lacked conviction. Sheriff. Anderson smiled grimly. Actually, we can. You see, Mrs. Martinez came to me 3 weeks ago with some very interesting information about railroad corruption. And, James added, when I wrote that letter to you, I also wrote another letter to my father's lawyers. I told them everything about your schemes, about how you framed me, and about where to find the evidence I had hidden before I ran. Vincent's shoulders sagged as he realized he had been completely outmaneuvered. The evidence was destroyed years ago. No, it wasn't. I hid copies in a safe deposit box in Denver before I confronted you. I was young, but I wasn't stupid. Sheriff Anderson moved closer to Vincent. Vincent Hartwell, you are under arrest for theft, fraud, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent. As the sheriff handcuffed Vincent, the man who had seemed so powerful and dangerous just minutes before looked like nothing more than a tired, defeated criminal. This isn't over, Vincent said as the deputies led him away. I have friends, connections. I'll be out of jail before the week is over. Maybe, James said. But by then, the newspapers will have the whole story. Your friends won't want to be connected to you anymore. After Vincent was taken away, Eleanor and James stood alone in the yard, hardly able to believe what had just happened. We did it, Eleanor said softly. We actually did it. James nodded, but a look of sadness flickered across his face. Yes, we did. He gazed distantly down the road. In a few weeks, all the charges will be dropped. I can go back to my old life, reclaim my inheritance, return to the railroad business. Hearing those words, Eleanor's heart sank. Of course, James, or rather Thomas, would want to return to his world. Why would he want to stay on a small, dusty ranch in New Mexico when he could have wealth and power? That's wonderful, she said, trying to force a happy smile for him. You'll have everything back that you lost. James turned to look at her, a long, deep gaze. Eleanor, what if I don't want all of that back? What do you mean? What if I've learned that the most valuable things in life aren't money or power? What if I've discovered that a simple life with the right person is worth more than all the railroad empires in the world? Eleanor's heart began to beat faster. James, what are you saying? James stepped forward and gently took her calloused hands in his. I'm saying that the best thing that ever happened to me was the moment I knocked on your door to ask for work. I'm saying that I want to stay here, help you build this ranch into something special. I'm saying that I've fallen in love with you, Eleanor Martinez, and I'm hoping you might feel the same way about me. Eleanor looked up into his eyes, and there, she saw her future. A future filled with love, partnership, and hope. Tears began to well in her eyes, but these were tears of joy. Yes, she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. I do feel the same way. The starving cowboy who had come to fix her barn roof had given her something far more valuable than perfect carpentry. He had mended a broken heart. He had given her back the dreams she thought were lost forever with her late husband. And right there, in the sun-drenched yard of the ranch, a new life had truly begun.